I see folks trickling in. So again, thanks for joining us. We're just giving a minute or two here for some additional attendees to join in at the top of the hour. Great. Well, I'll go ahead and get started with a couple of introductory comments. I'm Andrew Conley. I'm the Chief Program Officer with Clean Fuels Ohio, and I'll be your MC for today's webinar. In terms of our flow today, I'm going to cover some welcome and introductory comments from Clean Fuels Ohio, as well as some housekeeping items about the webinar. We're going to hear about EV solutions from Jeff Hart with Mike Albert Fleet Solutions. We're also going to hear about some EVSE solutions from Kevin Cushman with Electrada. And then we're going to reserve some time at the tail end for your questions and answers. So you'll note that you have been muted. We are recording this session for future viewing of others who may not have been able to attend at the last minute here. So you are muted. We welcome your questions at any time throughout. If you hover over the bottom of Zoom, you will see a Q&A pane. You are welcome to chat us questions live. I will be the one voicing your questions, moderating those at the end of our session, but feel free to chat your questions live throughout. We can type some answers as we go, as well as circle back to key question themes that arise from multiple participants. So don't hesitate to chat us while we are talking. We really do want to interact with you at the end of the session. So really encourage your full participation and active questions and interaction here as we proceed. Briefly, I want to introduce Clean Fuels Ohio. For those of you who don't know us, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. Our sole mission is focused on the transportation sector. Our goal is to improve the efficiency, economic, and environmental performance of vehicles. That includes both fleet vehicles and motorist vehicles operating out throughout the state of Ohio. We are fuel and technology inclusive. We work on all efficiency technologies and alternative fuel and vehicle technologies that are commercially available. But today we're focused on electric vehicles. We have a program, Drive Electric Ohio, which is our program geared towards electric vehicles. It really has several key components. We have grassroots consumer education work that we do through local EV owner ambassador chapters. We have 6 of those throughout the state. We're engaged in some significant policymaker education at the local, federal, and state levels. We work closely with the investor-owned co-ops and municipal utilities. We do a lot of focus on fleet electrification, as you'll hear from some of our key partners today, as well as EVSE charging station infrastructure deployment. We also do engage quite significantly with dealers, and we have an increasing focus on ensuring equity and access to these technologies as the market evolves. With that, I do want to mention we are joined here by Brandon Jones, our consulting services manager. We are partially funded through the Energy Foundation and their Power a Clean Future Ohio initiative for local governments, and Smart Columbus, focused on the 11 county central Ohio area to provide free EV fleet analyses to public and private fleets who are members of these programs. We do that by gathering data on operations, establishing the key performance indicators and goals of the fleet, evaluating the commercially available options around EVs and EVSE, and providing a decision matrix largely focused on return on investment, total cost of ownership, cost per mile, as well as some other factors that are tailored to the relevant budget cycles, replacement cycles of the individual organization. And really our goal is to provide some strategic planning and recommendations that fit within the organization and fleet structure. So as I mentioned, we're joined by Brandon Jones here on our team, who's our consulting services manager and is the best point of contact to reach out to if Jeff and Kevin really pique your interest on the business case for fleet electrification. We're happy to jump in and provide some services to fleets to take this planning to the next level. And the deployment phase. So with that, I just wanted to mention a couple factors driving the EV market and why we think it's important for fleets to start looking at this today. This is based on recent research from the Bloomberg New Energy Foundation or Fund, Electric Vehicle Outlook 2020. They may have just posted, I haven't checked this week on the 2021 Outlook, but these same factors apply. What we're seeing driving the market is a lot of investment by companies. You see Ford, GM, major battery manufacturers all across the board of the supply chain, billions of dollars being poured into electric vehicle development, manufacturing, assembly, deployment. We see a lot of policy coming down the pike at the federal, state, and local levels to really spur and catalyze both the production and deployment and adoption of these vehicles. We see significant improvements quarter by quarter on the technologies themselves, as well as the economics of these vehicles. And to just drill into the economics a little bit more, we've really seen significant decreases in lithium-ion battery prices, which are the substantial price factors in the cost of the vehicles over the last decade. You can see almost a 90% drop in those. Similar thresholds of improvements in price and falling prices for the technology are projected over this decade, with really many McKinsey, the Department of Energy, other analysts projecting that when battery prices fall to about $100 per kilowatt hour, a number of the electric vehicles will reach price parity with internal combustion vehicles. So as that price parity is achieved over this decade, the market projects that significant adoption increases will occur. So right now we're seeing about 2.7% of new vehicle purchases as electric vehicles, with just a hockey stick here of growth. As we get close to that initial price parity in 2025, you see that jump by a significant factor. And then by 2030, many analysts predicting essentially about a third of new vehicle purchases, somewhere between a quarter and a third of new vehicle purchases being electric vehicles. So that's what we really want to talk about, getting the right framework on the business case for fleet electrification today. And so with that, I really want to turn over this conversation to some of our key partners. We've worked with these folks in a variety of ways. And so first, I'd like to introduce Jeff Hart, who's the president of Mike Albert Fleet Solutions. Mike Albert has been a great partner with Clean Fuels Ohio and a number of the public and private fleets that we work with, helping with a variety of solutions, sourcing a variety of electric vehicles, and being very flexible with how those financial purchases are constructed, whether those be leases or straight out purchases or some variations in between. So really with that, I'd welcome to Jeff to present to us on the business case for fleet electrification from Mike Albert's perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Kevin, you want to pull up our slides? So while Kevin's doing that, I just want to thank you, Andrew, for allowing us to participate in this webinar and to join the discussion on fleet electrification. Kevin and I are going to share a few thoughts around fleet electrification, and one, I hope that it leads to a meaningful discussion and that it will actually stimulate some active participation from everybody on the call today. We understand that there's varying levels of knowledge on the phone, so we've got a pretty diverse group. So we're going to start it at a macro level and sort of work our way down and unpack this whole issue or this whole story or transition of fleet electrification. So next slide, Kevin. So first, let's talk about disruptive innovation. The auto industry, and more specifically electrification of the industry, is evolving very, very quickly. Mike Albert has actually been leasing electric vehicles since 2011. Our first electric vehicle that we leased was a Nissan Leaf. However, we understand the momentum and the race of the market has changed, and all OEMs are actively engaged. And by the year 2025, we can expect to see several hundred makes and models worldwide that are electric. That's a significant shift in electrification, and it's really driven by this worldwide movement of environmental and social responsibility, as well as consumer demand for a vehicle that is easier to operate and is more cost effective to operate. Next slide, Kevin. So, as business leaders or leaders of our organization, we really ultimately have three choices. One, we can innovate, we can imitate, or ignore, right? And I think in many cases, most businesses are not in the innovation, right? We're not an Elon Musk innovating and creating this new opportunity, this new market. And so we fall in sort of this imitate or ignore. And I'm hoping through this discussion that we don't end up on the ignore side of the fence, right? That we actually land on more of the imitate and how we can apply this new technology to our businesses. Next slide. So the fuse is lit. We've seen massive announcements, probably more vehicle announcements just in the last 3 to 4 months than we had in the prior 5 years, with all the different makes and models that are announcing electrification and their strategies to move us forward. So the choice is not to ignore the technology, but to imitate or reinvent our business and the evolution of a vehicle electrification. Next slide. But fundamentally, as fleet managers, our task is to provide a vehicle that will take a person and/or product from point A to point B. So if you think about a taxi, a rideshare company, they're in the business, or a busing company, right? They move people from point A to point B. Amazon, FedEx, UPS, or some of these other last mile providers, they move products from point A to point B. And then if we think about electricians, HVAC companies, plumbers, they're moving people and products from point A to point B. So no matter what industry you serve, you're in the business of moving a person or a product from point A to point B. So let's not mystify fleet electrification. As a fleet manager, the task at hand is rather simple. It's moving something from point A to point B. And we can use a traditional vehicle, gasoline or diesel, or we can use an electric vehicle. It's just a different energy source that allows us to fill the task at hand. I think everybody on the phone has some level of experience in managing a fleet, and we need to proceed really with the same steps that we've deployed for decades. My company's been in the business for 65 years of managing fleets and launching fleets. And as I mentioned, help electrifying fleets for the last decades. With electrification, there is a few different steps, things to consider. But overall, it starts with what your corporate strategies are. What is that strategy? Growth or cost reduction or whatever it may be. And more specifically, do you have an environmental or social leadership strategy that will assist you in picking a fleet strategy? You obviously need to give consideration to your use cases. How are you going to use the vehicles? Do you need sedans, pickups, vans, heavy-duty trucks? All the different applications that you have in your own business. You need to give consideration to route analysis. What are those daily driving patterns? How far are your individuals driving? Are they a highway? Are they inner city? What's their frequency of stop, etc.? We need to think about cycle intervals. How long is that vehicle standing or parked versus how long is it on the road? Life cycle consideration. Based on the use cases, how long do you really want to operate that vehicle? There are certain industries that they have a number of vehicles in their fleet. Some of them might actually have a life of 7 to 8 years, and some are going to have a life of 3 to 4 based on the use case. And then when you think about what is your desired public perception and how does that impact client satisfaction? And then one of the other considerations I like to think about is, how does this support your associates, your drivers, and the ultimate associate satisfaction or your employee satisfaction? So these are just a few considerations that we all use when we're evaluating the direction of a fleet. And so for over a decade, we've been helping consult governments and corporate entities on this transition from fleet to electric vehicles. One of our clients, they decided they did not want to go all in on electrification. But what they did go all in is they decided they were going to do a hybrid model first, and then eventually gravitate over to an electric model, right? A baby step from a combustion to hybrid to EV. We have another company that went from basically taking their traditional business, leaving it with ICE and diesel, but a new part of their business they launched with all electric. And then we have a third entity that started basically redid their entire fleet, Columbus Yellow Cab, and they went with electric and a hybrid. And what's been so exciting with what they have been able to accomplish, we actually just talked to them yesterday. They cut their operating cost in half from what they were doing with their traditional ICE engines. But they also mentioned that it wasn't just the fact that they reduced their TCO, but they also had these vehicles spending less time in the shop, so managing that time and the transportation to the shop, which meant those vehicles could be actually outperforming the task at hand, moving people from point A to point B. So they were spending less money and spending less time in the garage. So from a pure fleet perspective and a process, much of your fleet activities will follow the same process that they've done in the traditional fleet management aspect. The difference is really going through the selection and understanding the various use cases where we can apply electrification or electric vehicles. And really just, it's all getting down from pulling it down to a different energy source, whether it be gasoline or electric. So the key note here is really not to ignore electric vehicles, but start to understand and start moving your organization down the path of electrification and being thought leaders in your community and your industry as we move forward, and obviously supporting your ultimate business objectives. So Kevin?
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate those comments and that framing. And obviously our next presenter is Kevin, as you just framed up. Kevin is the CEO of Electrada, and Electrada has a number of innovative solutions for folks of both fleets and site hosts of EVSE charging stations, and have been doing some innovative things with partners in Ohio and beyond. So with that, Kevin is the CEO of Electrada, and welcome, Kevin, to give us some comments from here.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew and Jeff. A little more background on our company. We don't have nearly the track record or a length of operation that Jeff's team at Mike Albert does, but we're more of a new entrant over the last couple of years in EV infrastructure, and our model is slightly different than those you may have heard before. We're not an OEM of equipment. We don't provide technology, but what we do is we build, own, operate, and manage infrastructure systems with and for partners. So that ranges from municipalities to corporates, workplace environments, and into fleets. And the goal being reducing the risk of adoption. And we realize that there are a lot of folks that are on the line today that are in different stages of the education process or adoption process. They have tried a couple of vehicles or in the process of thinking about piloting. So more broadly, our goal, and Jeff, I think, agrees, and why we've teamed up to work together on several opportunities, is that it is a consultative process, as Andrew mentioned. They have a whole group working on how to get folks through the process of understanding the drivers, understanding how they synthesize around a strategy for electrification. And our groups, Mike Albert and Electrada, team up essentially as the delivery mechanism, the solution providers in that regard, because there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and we'll discuss those here in the next few minutes before we open up for questions. So as compared to Jeff's very easy on the eyes slide, this is about as bad as it can get in a Zoom environment, so I apologize for that. But I think when you think about business case and how to construct a business case, especially if electrification is new to your organization, first and foremost, and this applies to our business as well as anyone trying to attack a new opportunity, how do you look at stakeholder alignment and engagement? And so I've just put up some initial questions, and this isn't all inclusive, although it looks like it might be, but highlighted a few in each individual stakeholder's realm of how a decision like this for electrifying a fleet, which by definition is core to your organization's function, how does that impact their day-to-day decision-making and long-term decision-making? So from the C-suite of what this does for your brand, to be able to monetize or highlight your transition to a more sustainable fleet, to a finance decision around what does TCO really mean in an electric environment versus managing a WEX fuel card or doing things just to basically optimize day-to-day route structure, to even things like the human resources side of what do I do about change management? When, as Jeff described, you have a much different approach to maintenance and support of vehicles that have many fewer moving parts. The maintenance requirements are far lower, but you have a team. That team will still be engaged as the transition occurs from traditional ICE vehicles over to electrics. But what happens when you get toward that end of the cycle? What happens with those folks? How do we make them part of the team that supports this? And not just to clear resistance, it's actually empowering all the folks on the team to feel like they're part of this process. So I think stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement is really critical. And for us, part of the diligence process when we first interact with a fleet partner from the very beginning is who are not just the decision makers, but what are the education requirements within each stakeholder group. So again, to overemphasize that communication early on is really, really important, even if your end goal in the next 6 months or a year is just a phase 1 pilot. It's about grabbing these components of the decision process, articulating them, and then keeping the teams involved. So as we think about the types of questions that folks within that stakeholder group would pose or would have to deal with or grapple with as we think about electrification, we've identified a few considerations down the left-hand side, categorized them relative to those areas, and just thought through what are we being presented with here? What are the new variables that ultimately end up in an economic equation that an organization is going to have to filter through? And how do we prioritize reviewing those decisions, reviewing those variables, gaining comfort with them, and determining what role we want to play in managing them, or what role we're going to ask a partner to play in managing them. So we highlighted a few from the obvious being the emerging models of vehicles, most of which don't have multiple years of runtime behind them. If you exclude the passenger vehicles, the Leafs, the Bolts, Teslas, et cetera, you're being asked to consider an array, a catalog of new vehicles, even though they might come from a trusted brand like the F-150 in the next several months. But you have to think about what does that mean in terms of the adoption risk of that vehicle. Do we want to think about maybe a shorter tenor? Do we want to offload the risk of owning that vehicle through the process? So you might think about lease structures or a staggered conversion. From a fuel management perspective, thinking about electricity as a fuel, many more components to that discussion as well. It's not either having a tank on site or having a card that you use for a discount during travel, during the daily duty cycle. It's about who serves my depot site with power. How, if I have take-home vehicles, how does that work with employees in that regard? How do we think about demand charges, and what about battery life, and how all those things mixed in to either creating confusion or risk in my TCO calculation, or how do I remove that risk? So one option is looking to a partner who might provide a wrap or a turnkey solution as a charging services provider. Infrastructure, the same approach. Depots may range from the most simple 20 trucks in a parking lot. We don't have to do much other than drop infrastructure in and serve that load over the course of a few years, to things that might look like there's a hybrid implementation. I might need intraday charging where I have routes in the morning, routes in the afternoon, and I need to take advantage of lunch times or break times and right size capacity for charging for those instances. Intelligence, what do we do about the data? There's a tremendous wealth of data, both from the vehicle side that many of you are used to harvesting from telematics, but also from the charging infrastructure. How do we look at where we think about expanding existing fleet depots? Do we right-size depots? Do we put them in a different part of the zip code or our service territory because the economics or the electric service, the combination may make for a stronger business case? So you start thinking about the different layers of the planning environment here, not to intimidate the decision-making, but just to inform it. And then as you think about the ROI case, really getting a sense of what the drivers for TCO are, and they're beyond just the fuel cost replacement and the initial vehicle cost. It's the maintenance component. It's what do you do as far as optimizing route structure and design for the new range of the vehicles, for example. And then finally, I mentioned earlier, change management. how do we take this on as an organizational initiative and not just something that gets pushed down from the top because it's either cool to talk about sustainable initiatives, or my CEO is getting pushed on ESG this year from institutional investors, or I need to look good in front of the community I serve. It's how do we think about change management as being a two-way street, and that the folks inside the business are considered stakeholders as well. So one diagram or illustrative option that we personally work on, Jeff and I together, is what we call turnkey fleet electrification. And there are multiple flavors of this, of course, and multiple options, including this and excluding this. But what, just to provide an example, this is something that's much more comprehensive. It incorporates the turnkey provider on the right, providing the infrastructure, the power, the capital, and a performance contract that essentially says, I'll deliver you this amount of power to this many vehicles over this period of time, and we'll provide a service level agreement. Think of it almost as an Amazon Web Services outsourced hosted server capacity relationship with your IT group, and teaming with the fleet owner, where the fleet owner has full control over how many vehicles, at what time, and where they go, and how my duty cycles are managed. So the goal here is solve the pieces of the puzzle, those variables on the previous slide that are either yet to be determined or need definition. Do those with a capital partner that removes the investment risk from the process, and still allow the fleet owner to control the pace of conversion as well as how the vehicles are used, and really stay in the driver's seat, so to speak, relative to the change management inside the organization. What we think that does is it takes the weight from the fleet owner out of this view of, I have to be a system integrator of this whole thing. I have to all of a sudden become expert at the new vehicles, power instead of petroleum, and what do I have to do to make sure I don't have a leakage in the ROI case in front of my CFO. And it allows it to really operate in a partnership environment over a long-term period of time. And again, it's more of a relationship. It's less of a sale. It's less of a, hey, we'll sell you the chargers, hope for the best, tell us how it goes. It's really aligned risk reward for both parties. So I wanted to present that as an option, because that model, even though others are talking about it in different spaces, it's still relatively novel in the environment here. And then, again, back to our theme of not trying to avoid making this a one-directional presentation format. Our goal is to stop the presentation part of this and really open it up for questions from the group. Ping us with examples, questions, no matter how basic. Our goal, and I think Andrew's done a great job with the CFO team here, is to start this process, and what we hope becomes a rolling, set of forums over, every couple of months, where we bring different voices to the conversation and allow folks to highlight their own issues or concerns they have in the process of moving this forward. And then, just remove the risk, kind of as Jeff said, demystify the process, even though there are new variables to conquer, making sure we're all moving down the education pathway in the same way. So with that, I'll stop the slides and open up for questions.
Great, yeah, and certainly as Kevin and Jeff have said, please chat us your questions. We're happy to address them and speak through a number of detailed issues, no matter how basic here. I know I have a couple of questions that I can field here to kick us off. So really just to go back in order, Jeff, on the Mike Albert side, can you talk about electric vehicle model availability? And normally fleets are purchasing from a specific dealer or such. How can Mike Albert help solve for model availability, or fleets that may have different kind of makes and models that they're looking at in the electric vehicle space?
We have really two paths of acquiring vehicles. First path is dealing directly with the manufacturer and maximizing the fleet incentives. Obviously, we can get better fleet incentives with larger fleets. Second path is, yes, we have a whole dealer network we work with to get those type of vehicles. Now, when you talk about vehicle electrification, if you think about the big three out of Detroit, those three, you see their brand on every corner. There are lots of other electric vehicle suppliers that we've seen in the news, and I won't get into all the specific names, that offer some very compelling products. They're just not mainstream on what we're using. We maintain a pretty extensive catalog. We maintain relationship with all the OEMs, the big three, all the international OEMs, as well as some of the new domestic OEMs. So we have those relationships, and what we do is we build basically a cost analysis model, a feature benefits model across each one of the vehicles as we consult with the client to make sure we understand the right application. Obviously, if you're going to be hauling 2x4s around, a Nissan Leaf is probably not the best option, right, or the option of choice. And so we really like to understand the use case first, and then we present to you the various options. And then obviously in the ICE engine, it's one set of comparison, and then in electrification, it's another set of comparisons. But we give you a side-by-side grid on the various options, not just including purchase price, any upfit cost, as well as we like to share what the anticipated TCO cost would be over the life of that vehicle.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question from the audience here, obviously we see the spectrum of kind of class 1 through 8, or maybe 6, 7. Oh no, there's 8 behind you. What's your feeling now or sense of the market in terms of light trucks like the Ford F-Series, who've seen a lot of buzz about recently electrifying, and the Transit Series vans? Those we've heard from a lot of fleets that they're really waiting for those kind of assets. Not as many fleets have large scale sedans in their operations, lots of light pickup trucks, half-ton pickups, and cargo vans. What's your sense of when those will become available and cost effective?
Well, I want to answer that two ways, Andrew. We typically see the spectrum, because what we've also seen in a lot of applications where somebody thinks they need a pickup truck and they really could get by with a sedan. But traditionally they just bought pickup trucks because they thought it was easier. So the plethora is obviously quite broad. I think when we think about the trucks and vans, I mean, obviously it's been a lot of pressure on the consumer market, and you're seeing those move. I think you'll start seeing a lot of movement towards the end of 2022 and into 2023, where we're going to see a lot more product from the truck and van side. Even when you think about the Ford Transit, I mean, the first van is going to be a cargo. You're not having the passenger in the van, but there are ways we can work with different companies that do applications to do conversions of those vans into a passenger van. Or we could also be looking at a cutaway, which is more similar to what you might just get the chassis, right? And it's sort of what you see at the airport, right? You see the cutaway, and then you have on the back where the passenger sits. So there's lots of options, but today you definitely are limited in product availability when it gets into some of those work trucks. But Ford sent out a game changer this week. That was a real big game changer.
Yeah, I saw you come off mute, Kevin. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Jeff nailed it. And it's the only point I'd make is because it's a staggered release for work trucks and the medium duty vehicles, I still think waiting until the point where the vehicle's ready to start thinking about the electrification strategy is too late, because ultimately the planning process around building out or configuring a depot for electrification should go parallel with as vehicles become available, or you start to think about planning for that conversion, because it is a multi-year conversion. I don't think anyone on the line would agree that we're going to drop everything in year one and convert everything today. It's going to be a stagger, and you're going to have to plan for it. So waiting to plan is actually something we'd encourage avoiding.
Yeah, and we certainly share that perspective wholeheartedly at the Clean Fuels Ohio front. I mean, certainly we are in the early days of the vocational truck electrification, but it's coming down the pipe fast and furious, with more and more releases planned, quarter by quarter as we go forward, from the major traditional OEMs like Ford, GM, and others, as well as some new manufacturers like Rivian, Lordstown, Workhorse, and others as well. So there's going to be a lot more product in this space very soon. But I think to your point just now, Kevin, even if you were to purchase some of those that are available today, there might be a 6-month lead time even on delivery. So as we look at that, now is really the time to plan for the infrastructure, plan for that scaling growth on that side of the coin, as well as making sure okay, at what threshold is a pickup going to make sense? Is that a certain cost of entry point, capital cost point? Is that a certain battery range that you need for the key trenches of your fleet? So knowing those kind of points will make it much easier for you to maximize the opportunities as they come into play in that planning process. So one of our audience members has asked some questions about installation and electrical demand costs. But before we kind of get into those weeds, I thought, Kevin, maybe you could add a little more detail. Right now we're kind of in the burgeoning market of EVs as we get into the vocational spaces, but there's no shortage of EVSE hardware in the market today. In fact, if you're a fleet, it's probably a head scratcher of how do I sort through all these different options of all the different hardware makes and models and levels and speeds of charging. Maybe could you orient folks into some of the way into thinking about that before we dive into more of the detail on setup costs and electrical demand charges and things?
Sure. No, happy to get into the detail, but I think generally the view on EV charging infrastructure and from where we sit as an investor and a developer is that we pick best in class for the use case. So we're not tied to one manufacturer, one type of configuration. So we share the same view that the fleet owners do, which is we have to make sure reliability is number one. And currently, despite the plethora and proliferation, as you described, Andrew, of technology in the market, reliability is not commoditized. You could have two L2 machines sitting next to each other, vastly different track record, vastly different reliability stats, and operating under things as different as weather stress or how punishing the users are within a fleet environment. How often those connectors work? Do they have cable management systems, for example? So it isn't just, let's look at these two 7 kilowatt or 20 kilowatt chargers and pick the cheapest one. It's not like buying gas. There's an ASTM spec for gas. You know how it works. You know where it goes. You know how it burns. Reliability isn't commoditized there. So we view the same through that same lens of think about attributes, think about outcomes, and one of the outcomes has to be high nines reliability. Think of it as almost a micro utility that's being deployed at your depot, and you want the lights on all the time. So I'd start there and then start thinking about how the cost structure supports that decision.
Yeah, and certainly this question is, do you also work to set up the installation and control of electrical demand? Maybe as you answer that, you can also speak to, certainly traditionally the chargers have been talked about as, level 1, the 110 wall outlet, level 2, 208, 240 volt, level 3, 50 kilowatts and up. But really we're now starting to see a whole higher echelon of gradation on that, fast, super fast kind of chargers of the future. Maybe you can answer that question with some view towards how the different levels of charging can affect the variables in the answer to that question.
That's a great way to position it, Andrew. And it's almost invites you to think about pivoting. And what we do is pivot the view of, okay, our charging process has to fit the equipment. Let's make the equipment fit the use case. So if your vehicles are going to be overnight, every night return to base, they're going to be sitting there for 10 to 12 hours. There's a charging capacity, and especially a vehicles per charger ratio that you need to think about to optimize the investment, to absolutely serve the load required to get those vehicles out the door at the beginning of the day fully charged, but not to overbuild and not to create undue stress or disruption or additional capacity requirements on the site. But I think about the delivery model where you might have 80% of your vehicles in that circumstance, but 20% have a ton of intraday miles. They're going to need to charge quickly. So you might need to have some overnight charging, some intraday 200, 350 kW charging, and that creates a completely customized implementation approach. It's not one you can just call ChargePoint or ADB and say, hey, I need this. You're going to have to start with essentially the session time. What does that use case translate to in terms of charging session time? How do you predict that? And what we do is produce a 10-year load shape and say, for this many vehicles occurring at this site for these reasons, with this amount of charge requirement, how would I shape the capacity for the life of the assets themselves? So a lot of diligence on the front end. And then you start thinking about managing the cost of serving that power and what you can do during the process of charging. How do you manage demand charges? How do you reduce the overall fixed cost of power in that regard? And a lot of it's choreography of charging between charges, overnight, et cetera. And part of what the partners that we use, the technology we use, is being able to do managed charging in that sense. And essentially end up owning the meter with the utility. So all the costs of that power and all the risk associated with managing power consumption is on us. We're not asking you guys to become experts about choreography and demand charge reduction during the process.
Yeah, so what, yeah, obviously you mentioned a number of great things in that answer, but to this very specific question of does Electrada work on the setup, installation, and control of electrical demand, the answer is yes, yes, and yes is what I heard.
Yes, yes, and yes. And that really is the basis of our relationship is what do you need, how often, what battery capacity, and we serve it at the least cost per kW that we can.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, you talked about, ASTM spec fuels being a fungible commodity and some more specifics and differences in the electric vehicle and the charge times. Really, like there's kind of two elements of the demand from my perspective. There's the demand charges from the utility itself. Should you exceed 50 kW in this period of time, maybe you're subject at that location under your rates to an extra charge per kilowatt above a certain threshold. But there's also just the demand of when you plug in, are the electrons free flowing into that vehicle, or do you want to shift that, start time of charge over time? So maybe you can just speak a little more to those two sides of the demand at a location.
So that's again another good point, Andrew. So just simply from an electrical perspective, as most of the folks know, or many folks know, utility rates are comprised of two primary components. One is the volumetric charge, how many kilowatt hours you're using during the day. The other is a demand charge, which basically is set every year based on the highest hour of the day that you use power at that location, at that meter, over the last 12 months. So if you spike demand at a certain point, that's now your demand charge for the next year until it's reset again. So that's one to obviously avoid. The only way to avoid that is to be very careful about managing how that spike could occur and removing that risk. In that sense, configuration the charging capacity is important, but the choreography and when, to your point, Andrew, when that vehicle's plugged in at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, it might not start charging until 10:30 p.m. Not only because we want to avoid that coincident peak, essentially all the vehicles starting to charge at 6 p.m., to feather it out, level it out, and allow for the duty cycle to be served sometime during the 12 hours before it's, someone gets in the driver's seat and takes off with it again in the morning. So all of that burden needs to be thought through and make sure that it translates into the lowest cost per mile. Our ultimate goal is to beat the cost of gas that you're replacing. And it's very simple. So all of that gets bunched into, if I'm paying 12 cents a mile now, if you're giving me 11 cents a mile or 10 cents a mile, I like that. And you own the risk. So that's kind of the shoes we step into. But again, considerations that need to be thought through.
Yeah, and at the top end of this, I mentioned, price parity being achieved over this decade, and really what that was referring to, and I was a little inaccurate or not precise in my language, is that upfront capital cost of the vehicle. So like right now, really, we are seeing a slam dunk cost per mile savings and maintenance cost savings on these vehicles, where you kind of lose out in the TCO or have a potential challenge in the TCO is how much additional cost is the EV from the conventional vehicle, and how much is the cost of installing that charging hardware. That's really where the big additional costs come into the equation right now. So if we over the decades see an elimination of or at least a parity on the upfront cost vehicle to vehicle, that's a big game changer and tipping point in those market projections. So I think to dig into that a little bit more, Jeff, I'd be really curious to hear, beyond that upfront cost and some of those obvious differences in having a liquid conventional petroleum fuel versus a battery, are there any other kind of hidden cost or things purchasers of EV should be aware of? I often hear questions like, is the warranty different? Is insurance different? Is registration different? Like beyond just the basics of just the battery versus the gasoline, are there any other key things you'd want to flag difference-wise?
Yeah, from a warranty perspective, I mean, you're getting 8 years, 100,000 miles on the vehicle, the battery. So you're in pretty good shape from that regard. As far as other hidden cake cost, I mean, we are seeing different states putting different whether it be vehicle registration or tag renewals, right? They're putting on a fee because they're not capturing it on tax on the gas. So that is starting to roll out. Some states are more progressive and aggressive on that front than others, some aren't. I think though, on the flip side, and Kevin talked about, our goal is to beat the cost of gasoline. There's a lot, and we are seeing a reduction in TCO cost because guess what? You don't have the oil to change all the time, and you don't have all these fluids that are make up the combustion engine. But we want to also think about just the amount of time that your staff spends at the gas station, right? That is potentially derailment time that you can get back. That is just non-productive, non-value-added time. And in many cases, and we see this in fueling, sometimes drivers sneak a little bit, and depending on what type of card you're using or how tight you have the controls, other things are getting purchased that aren't really related to the fueling. So there's a lot more savings there than we would expect. But once again, Brent or Andrew, to answer your question, I think some of the hidden costs are going to be more in the titling and the tag renewal. That is still evolving and moving forward.
Yeah, so specifically on that front, in Ohio has put in place a $200 EV registration fee to capture, what lawmakers felt was the fair share of gas tax that's lost at the pump. We could open up a whole debate on whether that is a fair share and what that means. And certainly we're on record as advocating for lower registration fees than that for electric vehicles here in Ohio. But yeah, that's really what you're referring to in the titling, is just that extra sticker fee potential that some states are putting on.
It's funny. It definitely came out to shock a lot of people, right? My wife, being one of who drives electric cars, she was livid with that incremental fee, and I'm like, you're making it up. Trust me.
Yeah, there's certainly still a pathway for cost per mile and maintenance cost savings on these vehicles, especially if you're an individual motorist who can plug in at your garage or something like that. So one of our questions from the audience is, how accurate are vehicle range estimates, especially in terms of variables like cold weather versus hot weather, some of those climate control needs? Yeah, Jeff, can you speak to that? And
we're seeing varying degrees. I mean, for the most part, I think the manufacturers nowadays are doing a much better job than what they were doing years ago. So, but you are going to have an impact. The more AC you're running in that vehicle, right? There's a draw on the battery. The more things that are going on, plugging in your phone, your computer, the more draw is. But you are seeing some variation in weather. But I would say, if we were headed to have this conversation 3 years ago, it might be a little bit more of a material conversation. I have not heard of any material issues right now. We got customers throughout the entire United States and all the regions, hot and cold, that are running EVs. And I'm not hearing a ton of complaints.
Yeah, there's certainly, like you said, Jeff, I mean, it's drawn on the battery, it's going to impact the range, but certainly there's improvements being made every day with the new vehicles that come out. And certainly, at least from fleets in Ohio, we've seen more of an impact in the cold weather use of the heater than the warm weather use of the AC so far. Yeah. We have more information on that. Yeah, there are a variety of technologies out there that can add some efficiency factor here, and I've even heard some fleets that are buying steering wheel and seat warmers, because for that kind of extends the range of time that you may not fully need to have that heat on blast and things like that to add efficiencies, as well as some aftermarket devices as well.
That's a great thing, Andrew. We can start, and we've been starting to do some of this analysis, looking at some of the EV and try to understand the ranges that's happening throughout the country. So we're able to start doing some of that initial data analytics, but it's a ways off to get really predictable on that. But I would say the manufacturers have done a nice job improving that.
Yeah, very much. And, I think one of the things here that's interesting about electric vehicles and the charging stations is the level of data that's available. So maybe, we could talk a little, like, for a traditional conventional fleet operator, the kind of best case you can get is a telematics device on all your vehicles and a fuel card that gives, pretty robust metrics on every time you swipe that at the pump, and it's tied to the vehicle. Essentially, all that is functionally built into EVs and charging stations. So maybe you could each speak to that a little bit more from that side of the equation, and how that data enables you to get, better optics into ROI and some of these other aspects of the electrification.
Kevin, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start. I think inherently, when you're projecting forward a multi-year relationship like we are when we're investing behind a system, an electrification system, we want to make absolutely sure it's not just from a reliability perspective, you're seeing state health and readiness on the vehicle, which obviously there's telematics there already, but how the vehicle and the charging solution interact is critical, because you're going to see and will need to be able to predict and then refine your modeling to account for the miles per kWh that you're going to be seeing in real time. We can model that all the way, 10 years based on what the manufacturer's telling us, what we think the telematics is telling us. What really happens on the ground could be, moving around based on driver behavior. It could be based on any number of things, how upfits impact the draw on a battery. That type of relationship between what the vehicle is actually doing and how it presents itself in a state of charge back to the charger is critical to making sure we not only have the right amount of charging there, but we've allocated enough charging time to take care of that session. So again, back to the idea of managing costs down, it's about a constantly refreshing equation, in essence, of the 50 vehicles at that site, when they're showing up, when they should be scheduled to show up. So does that change route design? Does that change duty cycle or timing at all? Or if you don't have the luxury of doing that, how do we accommodate that flexibility with additional capacity? So having all of that rich data from both the charging and the vehicle side is critical. And then layer on top of that, the value of time of use rates and the energy costs at different times of day. And although it's more prevalent on the coast, those components are moving inward to our part of the country. Part of the math as well is solving for highest viable charging session at the least cost per kW. And that math is critical to making this electrification solution work and preserving that decision-making lowest cost per mile when you're changing from gas to electric.
Yeah, and to tie that back to a point you made in previous comments, where you said ASTM specs are fungible, and getting that like reliability, it's on the charging station side isn't necessarily just about lowest bid, lowest cost. So there's some considerations there. In terms of everything you're saying, it really depends on getting network chargers that are likely on an interoperable network, which is a cost to the fleet end user. So, if you're a fleet and you're saying like, hey, I could save a couple bucks today, get a non-network charger, just plug right into that, and maybe I'm behind the fence and I don't really need to worry about all these bells and whistles about networking. I mean, that would short circuit or not allow for everything you just laid out, because you wouldn't have that data about usage and ability to control timing. And maybe you could just speak more to why networking might be advisable, especially from a future proofing and admin controls nature of a fleet.
Well, it is a small incremental additional expense to think about networking and data capture and creating that intelligence layer that you really need, especially if you're phasing an electrification strategy in. How your next second, third, fourth phase of that decision occur should be largely based on what you're seeing from data that you've experienced and you've captured. So without that, you're still kind of flying blind and hoping for the best. And then we're kind of taking ourselves back to the 2011 days that Jeff mentioned earlier. Is just, this is really cool. Let's get a few and try it out. I don't think any fleet managers in this day and age have the luxury of trying it and hoping for the best at any scale. Onesie twosie things are one thing, but to make programmatic decisions that I think are available now require that kind of data capture. And ultimately, one of the reasons that we put our business together is to take all of those investment requirements to produce that outcome off the shoulders of the fleet manager. And we'll take care of that and present a ton of data, decision-making level data, and a lower cost.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Jeff?
No, I completely agree. I mean, it's really about one, we can say here's a use case, but until that vehicle is rolling, right, and we understand all the different attributes that are being drawn, what energy is being drawn from the vehicle itself, how's the driver driving, we need that ongoing data analysis, that feedback loop. So I completely agree.
Another question we had was, do you see consumers leaning towards one EV manufacturer versus another due to the type of charging infrastructure and networks available? How do you see that?
Kevin, I do not. Kevin, what about you?
No, I mean, they're leaning more based on brand loyalty and their view of the stability of that decision coming from the OEM, honestly. And you're going to see that play out over the next few years, depending on the new entrants, Arrival and Rivian and those folks in their window of opportunity here versus the Ford and the GM. But charging is universal. The new vehicles all have universal adapters, and there's a standard called OPCC that basically says here's how power is converted, here's how data is handled back and forth with the chargers, and the configuration of the connectors universal, except for Teslas, of course. But Teslas have their own adapter to universal charging. You just can't go the other way. You can't use a Tesla charger on a non-Tesla vehicle right now.
Yeah, and that question also, I'm chatting in the thread here. There is a dashboard that Ohio Department of Transportation and their Drive Ohio program maintains, so you can actually see live I'm chatting this now, or answering it this way. There should be an answered question now in the thread with a link. Let me see if I did that right. Yeah, so there's a dashboard where you can look at, by county, how many Teslas versus Bolts versus whatever other EVs are deployed here in Ohio. And there's some national versions of that as well if you want to get a feel. But certainly I would agree with the comments that right now it's been more a factor of brand loyalty than structural dynamics of, oh, I really like this charger network or system. And, the two biggest charger networks, Greenlots and ChargePoint, already have an interoperability agreement. So like if you have a ChargePoint account, you can pull up and use it to access a Greenlots charger and vice versa. So we're seeing more and more of that, as Kevin was also alluding to. There's a kind of a question and a comment about an electric trades center looking to have more hands-on opportunities with vehicles and charging infrastructure for their students. Certainly, I've been personally engaged in some projects recently around workforce development opportunities in the electric vehicle space. I think from my perspective, and I'm certainly from a very specific vantage point, but a lot of the conversation flows around, EVs as solely a climate solution. But it's real interesting to hear the federal administration and now increasing talk and in the Ohio legislature and governor's office about the long-term benefits in terms of manufacturing jobs, technician jobs, electrician, electrical installer, and maintenance jobs. So maybe as we finish up here, do you have any comments that you'd want to add on kind of the bigger picture ecosystem and opportunities beyond just the fleet of how electrification can benefit the wider economy?
So Kevin, I think this really fits your ecosystem, right? Because the opportunities, I mean, you got a huge network.
We, for a company emerging into the space, we've purposefully gone out to communities and tried to build relationships that are outside of the fleet environment first. So we started with destination charging or workplace charging and building relationships with groups like Procter & Gamble for their workplace implementation, the same way we do with cities that are like Hamilton County here in Southwest Ohio, where we're building into their garages just to create the awareness of what reliable infrastructure looks like. So in that same realm, we're talking about universities and other institutions that have that sort of hybrid opportunity to provide education to their students or their teams and really be looked at as a hub, an electrification hub, where you can understand how this equipment works, that it's not scary, they actually have use cases that are built in, test and train, and use it as a focal point. So we're really interested in supporting opportunities like that because obviously awareness and education is a big part of where both Jeff and I are in the process of moving electrification forward. So any steps that can advance that, we're happy to participate. It just goes in part of building out that ecosystem of partners who are thinking about this similarly, even though you might not arrive at the same solution.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're certainly hitting our hour. So I just want to thank you, Kevin and Jeff, for joining us and sharing your expertise and answers to these questions. As I chatted in the thread here, we have recorded this webinar and we'll be sharing that back out with the registrants who have participated today. And all three of our organizations welcome further interactions with you. Kevin's put his contact information in the chat thread here, and certainly in the emails that go out, we'll share contacts with all of us. So thank you all for spending part of your day with us. We really look forward to working with you on next steps for fleet electrification.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.